Alright, this video is going to cover the paragraphs that we looked at from Hedonism by John Stuart Mill. In this video, we're going to closely consider the passage that we read as part of the How to Read Philosophy exercise. And this will be the type of video that you can expect in our class when we read a primary source. So I'm not going to leave you alone to try to figure it out on your own. There will always be a video that goes along with the second read to help you figure out how the passage is supposed to go. And this will give you a chance to see how close your summary from last week was of the passage and to adjust your understanding of it accordingly. So we're going to begin at the beginning of the reading. The creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Okay, so when we start trying to figure out what's going on in this sentence, let's start by maybe identifying a word that we're unsure about. So maybe we know what creed means, maybe we don't. Here, I think the definition that most closely suits what we're looking for is a set of beliefs or aims which guides someone's actions. So what this sentence is saying is that the people who accept the greatest happiness principle as the foundation of their morals hold that an action is right if it tends to promote happiness and wrong if it tends to promote unhappiness. Awesome. Let's look at the next sentence in the reading. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain, and by unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. Okay, what might be tricky about this sentence? Well, certainly I don't really know what privation means. Let's look that one up. So, privation, the loss or absence of quality or attribute that's normally present. Cold is the privation of heat. Okay, so maybe we can change this a little bit to make it easier to understand. By happiness is intended the pleasure and absence of pain, and by unhappiness, pain and the absence of pleasure. Awesome. So we can see that in the second sentence, what we got is a definition of happiness and unhappiness. So, happiness is pleasure or the absence of pain, and unhappiness is pain or the absence of pleasure. So let's go back to that first sentence and put it all together. The creed, which accepts as the foundation of morals, utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So, when we add to this our definitions, happiness is pleasure or the absence of pain, and unhappiness is pain or the absence of pleasure, we end up with the view that we're considering in this passage, which holds that actions are right if they produce pleasure or avoid pain, and are wrong if they produce pain or avoid pleasure. And given the title of this reading, what we end up with is hedonism. Hedonism is the ethical theory that the right action is the action that produces the most pleasure or avoids the most pain. All right, this seems simple enough, but not so fast. We're going to quickly discover that for John Stuart Mill, there's more to this moral theory. So here we go as he starts to point this out. To give a clear view of the moral standards set up by the theory, much more requires to be said. In particular, what things it includes in the idea of pain and pleasure, and to what extent this is left an open question. And this is going to foretell what we're about to see in the rest of the passage. Interesting. However, he immediately sets this aside. But these supplementary explanations do not affect the theory of life on which this theory of morality is grounded, namely, that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, and that all desirable things, which are as numerous in the utilitarian as in other schemes, are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves, or as a means to promote to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. All right, so here Mill is pointing out that, however, whatever the answer is to the complications that he just pointed out, those answers aren't going to change the basics of the moral theory that we're considering. And here Mill introduces a new title for this view when he references the utilitarian. So Mill's view is known as utilitarianism, and we're going to see this in week 5 or 6, and he uses this phrasing rather than hedonism. So moving forward, we'll call it both. All right, so where are we now? Now, a problem is raised with hedonism or utilitarianism. Now, such a theory of life excites in many minds, and among them, in some of the most estimable in feeling and purpose, inveterate dislike. So, what's going on here? It's actually fairly straightforward. Basically, it turns out that many people don't like hedonism or utilitarianism as a moral theory. But why? Well, we find this out in the next sentence. To suppose that life has, as they express it, no higher end than pleasure, no better and nobler object of desire and pursuit, they designate as utterly mean and groveling, as a doctrine worthy only of swine, to whom the followers of Epicurus were, at a very early period, contemptuously likened. And modern holders of the doctrine are occasionally made the subject of equally polite comparison by its German, French, and English assailants. So we can see here that people's criticism of hedonism or utilitarianism is that if all you care about is pleasure, you're no better than swine. All right, interesting. So there's someone else that's mentioned in this passage that might be confusing to us. It's this fellow right here, Epicurus. So who is Epicurus? Well, Epicurus is an ancient Greek philosopher who lived between 341 BC and 270 BC. And he founded the highly influential school of philosophy known as Epicureanism. Now, the Epicureans believed, among many other things, that the goal of human life was happiness, resulting from the absence of physical pain and mental disturbance. So here we can see why the Epicureans are brought up when we're talking about hedonism, whether it's a fair comparison or not. All right, so let's consider where we're at in the passage. Well, we considered a moral theory called hedonism or utilitarianism that holds that a right action is an action that causes the most pleasure or avoids the most pain. And we've looked at an objection that's been raised against this view, that if all a moral theory cares about is pleasure, then the people who follow this moral theory are no better off than swine. All right, what's going to happen next? Well, as we'll see, we're going to immediately find Mill giving us a response to this criticism. When thus attacked, the Epicureans have always answered that it's not they, but their accusers who represent human nature in degrading light, since the accusation supposes human beings to be capable of no pleasures except those which swine are capable of. All right, so here we see that if you understand hedonism in the way suggested by the objection, it's you that's degrading human nature. This is because this objection means that you think that human beings are capable of no pleasure except the kind of pleasure that swine can feel, right? And this is how the objection works. Oh, hedonism means that we're no better off than swine, right? Well, if you believe that, then it must mean that you believe that humans are only capable of the kind of pleasure of swine. And so it's you who's degrading human nature. Or so the Epicureans respond. If this supposition were true, the charge could not be gainsayed, but then would no longer be an imputation. For if the sources of pleasure were precisely the same to human beings as to swine, the rule of life, which is good enough for the one, would be good enough for the other. So here there's another word that I would imagine that most of us don't know. I certainly didn't until I looked it up. Gainsaid. What does gainsaid mean? Well, gainsay means to deny or contradict, to oppose someone. So we can see that if this supposition were true, the charge could not be opposed or denied, right? So what that sentence is saying is that, hey, if it were true that humans were no better off than swine, or they couldn't feel pleasure other than swine, then there would be no way to respond, right? But this isn't true because, as we'll see, if it were true that human beings were capable of no pleasure other than that of pigs, the criticism, right, it could not be responded to, gainsay. However, if it were true that pleasure was exactly the same for humans as swine, humans would have the same rule of life as swine, right? And here rule of life means something like rules, way of life, lifestyles, and so on, right? But we obviously don't have the same rules of life as swines, so there must be something wrong with this. The comparison of the Epicurean life to that of beasts is felt as degrading, precisely because a beast's pleasures do not satisfy human beings' conception of happiness. Human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and, when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. So we see, comparing hedonism to living like a swine doesn't work, because what pleases a swine doesn't please a human. This is because humans find pleasure in more complicated things than animals, and wouldn't be happy if their pleasure doesn't involve these more complicated things. Okay, so now we're to the end of the passage. Let's look over the argument that we find here. All right, here's an overview. So we started by considering a moral theory called hedonism, or utilitarianism, that holds that a right action is an action that causes the most pleasure or avoids the most pain. Then an objection was raised against this view that if all hedonism or utilitarianism cares about is pleasure, then the people who follow this moral theory are no better off than swine. In response to this objection, it was pointed out that if humans experienced pleasure exactly like swine, this would be true. However, human pleasure is much more complicated than swine pleasure. So hedonism or utilitarianism is a moral theory perfectly suitable for humans. All right, now I want you to compare your understanding from your summary after the second read of the passage to what you understand now after watching this video.